The top spot among all immigrant groups in the 1980s is the Mexican immigrant population in the United States has continued to outsize other immigrant groups. In 2008, there were 11.4 million Mexican immigrants in the United States. Over half of the Mexicans in America are there illegally. Most of the Mexicans, when they migrate over to the U.S., all have a place to go to. The most common states they go to are California and Texas, but now it doesn't happen that much. It was very popular from 2000 to 2008. The Mexican-born population in the United States was larger than the total population of all but 7 U.S. states. Between 2000 and 2008, 11 states saw their Mexican-born population grow by at least 50,000. Here are some push factors of why Mexicans migrated over to the U.S. Mexico is not that developed compared to the U.S. Mexicans moved away from their home country because of the poverty they were facing. They migrate over to the U.S. so they can land a stable and better life, so that they get better standard of living. The crime rate in Mexico is very high, so this is why it appeals to Mexicans who have children, because Mexico is not safe for their family to stay in. Studies have showed that the living conditions in Mexico have become worse over these recent years, with the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. Many Mexican immigrants have chosen to come to the United States with the hope that economic conditions will be better. Between 1984 and 1989, moderate poverty rose from 28.5% to 32.6%. From the data shown, it shows that the government have not improved the living conditions of Mexicans over the years, with nowhere to turn but to the U.S. Also for these reasons that Mexicans migrate over to the U.S., because there's very poor medical facilities, low-paid jobs, poor education, life expectancy is low, and 40% are unemployed in Mexico. Here are some reasons for why Mexicans do not want to go to the U.S. Mexicans go to the U.S. to find stable jobs, but they can't do that when the only jobs available to them are labor jobs. But whereas if they stay in their home country, they get the priority, they get the jobs that they would like to have. Bear in mind, getting to the U.S. from Mexico is illegal. Mexicans have to go to extreme lengths to get into America. Here are some examples of what they have to do. They have to fit into the back of the car. They have to disguise as chairs of a car. They could swim and drown. They could go across an electrifying wall and they could electrocute themselves. These Mexicans risk their lives to get to the U.S. Some Mexicans would not like to go to those lengths, so they don't migrate. Also, being caught can have big consequences for them. Here are some positive effects for why Mexicans should migrate to the U.S. Illegal migration costs the USA millions of dollars for border patrols and prisons, so the U.S. can gain a lot of money from that. Mexicans are seen as a drain on the U.S. economy. Migrant workers get lower wages compared to American workers. Mexican migrants benefit the U.S. economy by working for low wages. Mexican culture has enriched the U.S. border taste with food, language, and music, which makes the U.S. more diverse. More consumers for the U.S. market. If Mexicans went over to the U.S., it would impact Mexico because the Mexican countryside have a shortage of economically active people. Many men immigrate, leaving a majority of women who have trouble finding marriage partners, so they can't pay for their children and for them to have a stable life. Young people tend to migrate, leaving the old and very young. Legal and illegal immigrants together send some $6 billion a year back to Mexico. Certain villages, such as Santa Ynez, have lost 2/3 of its inhabitants. Migration is difficult, expensive, and dangerous for those who enter the U.S. illegally across the United States border. The origins that the migration might affect would be Houston, Phoenix, San Diego, and Dallas. These states might be affected by the migration because they are the closest states from the United States border. Right now, the U.S. are enforcing the law so that consequences are more serious. Mexicans chose to go to the U.S. for a better life. This will be called voluntary migration. This is why it is different to slave trade. Even though the slave trade was a long time ago, it is still remembered as a huge event in history. The slave trade was a forced migration. They had to move around the world even if they didn't want to, whereas the Mexicans migrated due to their desires. If I was a Mexican and my town wasn't in a good state, I would try my best to leave the country, and I would try to bring my friends and family along, but since it is illegal to go over to the US, I wouldn't want to risk anything, so I would go over to the safest city in Mexico.